And for those of you not familiar with InFocus and with our training style, we like these lecture halls and classrooms. Not sure where that came from, it's many years ago, but we also use Prezi as well, which is an alternative to PowerPoint. And what that does is just, we find it a bit more dynamic. And so we move around the content on the screen as we go, and we zoom in and out, not too much. So I hope you won't get too dizzy, which can happen with Prezi. It's some quite soft movements around the screen, but it does allow us to zoom in, like you can see here, and start to go into the content bit by bit. And we're going to start with a general introduction and introduce those of us on the call. So just starting with myself, I'm a co-founder and a senior consultant at InFocus, and we're based in the UK. I'm based in Bath in the southwest of the UK, but I'm speaking to you from Washington, DC today, where I'm just out here for a couple of weeks. I have over 11 or 12 years now experience as an evaluator. So my main area is in monitoring evaluation, but also as a trainer, as a consultant, and supporting non-profit organizations with evaluation and learning solutions. And I've worked and trained in over 30 countries around the world. And this project is one of my main things that I do and really enjoy. I've worked in the field of sport for development for over 10 years, but still the topic of sport and disability is relatively new to me over the last couple of years. So I do defer to my much more experienced colleagues who are going to introduce as well, but also enjoy learning. And this, I'll often be asking questions that somebody new to this field will ask, which I'm hoping will also be useful. But my main role is a bit different today because it's into my specialist topic of monitoring evaluation. But my role is generally as a facilitator on these series of webinars. So what I'll do now is just introduce you to Amy. So Amy, if you could jump into the call, I might need to unmute you.
Hello. Hi, I'm Amy Finch from Spirit of 2012. I'm Head of Learning and Impact there. We are a devolved trust from the Big Lottery Fund in the UK, set up with a £47 million endowment to fund arts, sports and culture projects across the UK.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amy. And thanks for taking the time to join us today. And we'll be hearing from Amy and experiences of Spirit of 2012 a bit later in our call. And I wanted also to introduce the wider team that sits behind our series of webinars, behind these 6 webinars and the knowledge exchange. So that's Catherine Carty, who's actually with us today and will be coming in to introduce a part of our presentation. Catherine is a UNESCO Chair Project Manager for transforming the lives of people with disabilities, their families and communities through physical education, sport, recreation and fitness at the Institute of Technology. And I'm probably going to mispronounce this, as I will a lot of names, but I think it's Tralee, but Catherine, you may correct me on that, I'm sure. And the Chair of Global Partnership for Children with Disabilities, Physical Activity and Sport Task Force. Eli couldn't make it today, he's in a meeting, but he's a director of the Power of Sport Lab, co-founder of the Sport and Society Initiative at Brown University. And we have Sneh with us today too, who's the founder of the Indiability Foundation. And Sneh, for some reason, I couldn't make you an organizer, it wouldn't let me. So if you do want to jump in, please just give me a nudge and I'll bring you in as well. And then Amy Farkas, who is a founder of Inclusion for Development. And so this is our team that sits behind each of these webinars with an absolute wealth of expertise in sport and disability. I should say too that everybody, all of us, this is a voluntary initiative, the knowledge exchange. There's no one being paid for their time here, so we're just really grateful for everybody to feed in on these, to create these webinars and to make it so much fun as well. And before we start, and I realize some of you, many of you have been on these before, these webinars before, so this will be a bit of a repetition. So if you've seen this before, please feel free to grab a cup of tea and come back in a couple of minutes. But it's always important for those of you new to this to just explain what this project is. And so across this year and now early next year, we're running a series of 6 interactive webinars, so online workshops like the one today, that will bring together practitioners, funders and researchers that are working in the global field of sport for development and disability. And the aim is to share experiences, try and identify commonalities, common elements and differences in this kind of work around the world. And so we've had 2 webinars so far. This is the 3rd. We looked at inclusive activities in April. We looked at advocacy and how it can help advance inclusive sport back in May. We were then due to do a webinar in June, but just got very caught up, just personally with work, with a very busy summer. So there was a bit of a hiatus. And we've come back now in September, already refreshed, to deliver this 3rd webinar, which is, we've called it How to Monitor and Evaluate Sport and Disability Activities. It's as much about the challenges around this area, which we'll come to. But we then got a webinar in November, one in January, and then we're going to wrap up in February with the presentation of the resulting theory of change, which I'll come on to describe a bit later. We're always open to suggest any topics as well. So if you have any ideas of what we should be presenting on these webinars, please let us know, and then we'll see where this goes beyond the 6 webinars. That was just the sort of time and resource, again, as a voluntary project that we could commit to. So we're going to see then where it goes beyond this point, and maybe look at the results of this going into a journal article. We're going to see, but it's been fantastic input from participants on the first 2 webinars, so we're very keen to continue this month. And I think it's really important also to just to highlight that this is an exchange, and we really hope a genuine exchange of knowledge. So what we don't want to do is come onto these webinars and sort of present at you for 2 hours with a quick Q&A. What we want to do is, admittedly, the Q&A today is quite quick, but that's because we've got over what should be over an hour of getting input from the group today. If we need that long, we'll see. I mean, but we're hoping to get your views, get your thoughts on the 2 exercises that we have today. And you know, we won't also be presenting solutions on these webinars. What we're doing today is presenting more interesting challenges and topics than we are necessarily solutions. We hope there's going to be aspects you can take away and use, but it's as much about just getting interesting topics out to you all and having a debate and feedback, because we've got people, I think over 250 people have signed up and registered for the first 3 webinars, and they come from over 50 countries and all different kinds of backgrounds, as you're going to find out today. And so we've got an amazing variety of experience and knowledge that we're hoping to draw on. And we do each time. We get some fantastic suggestions and recommendations. So this is very much about drawing on your knowledge as a group. But feel free, if you just want to watch and digest, you can do that too. But we'd really encourage you to get involved. And our objectives today, we want to introduce very briefly the topic of monitoring and evaluation, just as much because we want to make sure we're on the same page with terminology, and also a theory of change as well that we've been developing that we want to use to sort of ground the discussion of monitoring and evaluation within a framework. We're then going to explore the key challenges and solutions from participants for measuring disability-related outcomes, using the experience of the Spirit of 2012 as an example, as a sort of driver for discussions. And then we're going to do the same for outputs as well. We've only got a limited amount of time. Once we finish introducing this, we want a bit of time at the end for Q&A. Then you can probably tell we have to be quite focused on what we then explore as a group. So we're looking at particular outcomes, particular outputs, but hopefully will be useful for the group, and at the very least interesting, which is what we're aiming for here. And just to then describe finally a bit about terminology before I get into a bit about monitoring and evaluation. So we do use the definitions within CRPD. So we for and the terminology for disability. So where, for example, in the UK, at least, if I'm up to date, I would use the term disabled person. What we do on this webinar is use the term persons with disabilities or people with disabilities, just so we have, because there are different terms around the world, we've settled on the UN terms just to keep things as standardized as we can, really. So please don't feel offended if it's a different term than you might use. We're trying to just standardize this as much as we can. And I would say too that if myself or Amy slip into the term disabled person, it's because that's more familiar. But we try as much as we can to stick to some common terminology on these webinars. And finally, terminology for sport for development. So we use the term. So we're generally focused on these webinars on sport for development. So sport for social change would be another term for this. And we're really looking there at the intentional use of sport and physical activity and play to obtain specific development objectives. We're looking less at, for example, professional sport, the development of professional athletes or elite sport. Now that will come in to our discussions, I'm sure, a little bit when we talk about advocacy. That will slip into the discussions, but we're generally focused here on those of you using sport for specific social aims. And so we make a distinction between sport development, so the development of the sport itself, and then sport for development, so about using sport for social aims. But I mean, we appreciate there's a bit of a blurred line, a grey line between these definitions. That there's often the cases where you're developing sport within a country, and if you're developing, for example, football or soccer, I think I'm in the US, so soccer is now the term in my head at the moment, but soccer or football, then, for example, if you are developing that and you're getting more young people playing and then they're getting the benefits of fitness, you know, there could be an argument maybe that there's a sport for development aspect to that. So it's just to say we are more focused on the right hand side here and on the use of sport for social change and for development. So that's our introduction that we go through on each of these webinars. So what I'd like to do to kick off today's topic is just to give a quick overview of some key terms, and I realize this will be quite basic for many of you, most of you I would think, but it's more about the terminology that we use. So we have a guidance sheet. We're going to send this out if it's of interest with this webinar, that we use it in Focus, just to make a distinction between monitoring, evaluation, and research. I'm not going to talk through all of this, but we generally see monitoring as the tracking of program delivery and performance over time, so regular check-ins, often more related to what we might refer to as outputs, so the direct results of activities like the number of participants and the demographic details of those participants. Evaluation we see as more periodic. It aims to explore and assess the results and impact of the program. So you might have formative evaluations that shape and improve a program, and summative evaluations that determine whether change has occurred. And then we at InFocus, at least, we distinguish this from research, which we feel is more about drawing general conclusions beyond the specific context of a program that monitoring evaluation might look at. So this is looking to add to our sum of knowledge in society about a particular issue or particular group. And often there are these other changes you can see here too, or other differences, sorry. Research potentially could be more robust in the techniques being used, often with a specialist, guided by a specialist researcher. But I won't go into those details, but just to say that we do have a distinction, and we're mainly, I guess, focused today on monitoring evaluation that is conducted by NGOs themselves, but just as interested really in research that's out there too. But when we refer to M&E, which we'll use today, we're speaking mainly to monitoring and evaluation. And it can have different terms too. I know in the US it's often MEL, measurement, evaluation and learning, or variants on that topic, but we're mainly focused on the term M&E, or monitoring and evaluation. And just to say too that we have a number of steps in focus, quite common to frameworks for monitoring and evaluation of the stages that you go through to monitor and evaluate. And today we're mainly focused on data collection really, and planning data collection and what tools and methods are being used, just because that felt like a natural starting point, and it was very aligned to the experiences of Spirit 2012. And I'll just refer to Spirit 2012 to the shortened Spirit, just as that's their shortened title they use, a bit easier on my tongue for the rest of the presentation. So we'll be focused today on these data collection elements of monitoring and evaluation. And the next thing I'd like to look at before we get into Amy's section and the Spirit experiences, what I'd actually like to do is to we're going to shortly come up and introduce the one-page theory of change, but I wanted to get you all a little bit involved just at this point, and I've got a poll I'm going to launch, which is going to come up on all of your screens. And just to say, so there are about 45 of us now on the call, and so what we're going to do is just launch a poll. This is going to come out to you all very shortly. And what I'd like to ask you, and this may be a tricky question to answer because you could be involved in a variety of different areas, but it'd be great to understand. So if you're involved in running sport and disability activities, so you're directly delivering with participants on the ground, or if you are a funder of activities, if you conduct research, or if you provide other support. And I know you could be involved in multiple roles, but we'd be really interested in what you feel your main role is within sport and disability. So I will just let that run for a minute, and then we'll share the results. And just while you're voting, Ron, welcome to the call, Ron. Ron Peck just asked if you can get a copy of that chart we just shared, and yes, I will send that. Everything you see today will be in your course materials, be it the tools that we present, the presentation itself, everything you will get. We wouldn't present anything that that is sort of you'd have to pay to access, or so. Just to say, yes, you will definitely get a copy of that chart and everything we show in this webinar. Okay, so we've nearly had everybody vote. So we're just going to give it maybe 10 seconds more if you want to get your vote in, and then we'll share those results. We were just curious to see where people sort of self-identified as being in the on this across these different questions. So we'll just now bring that up and share it with you all. And it's a good point to mention too that what we will do is also we're going to be sending out an email after this webinar to everybody who's joined, the 250 people who've joined these 3 webinars so far, and just to ask you about whether you would all be open to sharing your details with this wider group, because it starts to build into somewhat of a community. But so just to share those results, we've got the main category is 43% of you who are involved in running sport and disability activities. The second biggest area was providing other support. So we thought that might be through, for example, networking or doing what we do today, exchanging knowledge. We've got 19% who conduct research and 8% who are providing funding of some sort. So just thought it'd be interesting. We were very curious to see who was involved in the call. We have a better idea because you all write your descriptions when you join. And again, what we'll try to do is to, or what we will ask you is whether you'd be open to sort of sharing your name and details just with the wider group, so you can see where everybody is from. So we just thought that would be quite interesting to do. We're now going to just come into the theory of change part of the webinar. So this is just to explain firstly a bit about the background to the theory of change, and that should now be popping up on your screen. Yep. And so the origin of the knowledge exchange was in a series of webinars with 6 NGOs from around the world. Sneh, who's on the call from Indiability, was part of that group, and we went through webinars a couple of years ago to develop a common theory of change. So a theory of change is basically in effect a mapping technique to show how activities lead to outputs and outcomes, and how change occurs and the assumptions behind it. And we developed, I think it was an 8-page detailed theory of change from that process. And across the last few months in these webinars, we've been gradually updating that theory of change to share with you all in February next year when we finish these series of webinars. But what we've done for today's call is just to update that to create a 1-page version of the theory of change. You can see here. You will definitely also get this in your course materials, because we'd love to get your feedback as a group. And when we go through this in more detail in a couple of minutes, I'd also be love to get your feedback if you immediately spot anything that you feel is missing, or any changes to this you'd like to make. Would welcome your feedback in the question box as we go. Now we'll be going through this bit by bit in a moment, but this is basically our a 1-page version of the activities and outcomes and impact within that theory of change. We thought it'd just be useful to ground today's discussions within this diagram, so you can see what outcomes we're referring to, what impact we're referring to. And what then sits behind this is really on how theories of change can be used are as theory-based evaluations. So this is where the theory of change is then used as a basis to draw conclusions about whether an activity or an intervention has contributed to particular outcomes. So it's a way of structuring or undertaking evaluation that we really like it in Focus. Probably my favorite type of evaluation, because I always feel it grounds you in something that you can refer to and go back to and check, and challenges your assumptions. So today we're doing a bit of that, because we're using the theory of change we've developed with that group of NGOs that we've updated this year to sort of give you an idea of the areas we're talking about in terms of measurement today. And so what I'd like to do next, before Amy comes into the call, is just give you a closer look at this 1-page theory of change. I won't read it box by box, but I will just give you an overview. And as I mentioned, if you have any initial feedback, please do type it into the question box, and that's really useful to us. But there'll be plenty of time to feed into this at the end of these projects. We have a webinar dedicated to reviewing this, because each of the webinars that we run is updating this theory of change further. So we have an end product. We didn't want this to just be lots of really interesting discussions. We wanted something you could all use at the end of it. And so broadly, we've got the activities in orange on the left. We've got then a chain of outcomes. So these were the common outcomes across the global NGOs that we were working with, that are all working in sport and disability. We've got then a selection of a much wider range of outcomes, which were changes needed in wider society to support this chain of outcomes. And then we have on the right in green the overall impact that this is leading to. And so we've got this up here so we can pinpoint the areas that we're referring to when Amy and Catherine come in to present their sections of this. And so just to zoom in and give you a brief overview of each section. So we've got a range of activities that Sport for Development NGOs run. So that might be firstly at the top box, and I'll probably get my annotation pen out here. So in the top box up here, we've got activities that are directly engaging with people with a disability. That might be through access to recreational or competitive sporting activities. It might be personal development activities. It could be getting those people into education or employment. We then have activities that support the parents, families, or carers of young people with a disability, because many of you on this call I know are working with young people, and it was all of the group that developed this theory of change were in that area. It might be that organizations are building the knowledge and capacity of other organizations like local NGOs or schools to offer more inclusive sporting activities and volunteering. It might be supporting the integration of people with a disability into activities that then mix them in and help them to mix with the wider community. So they can be quite open access, so just inviting anybody to come to attend the activities. And then finally, it might be more advocacy work, so raising awareness and education around issues on disability. So we generally categorized a very wide range of activities into those groups, and then that led to a range of different outcomes, which we'll come to next. So there were, and again, I won't read box for box, but there were outcomes up here which related to the changes, the short-term changes for people with a disability, and then with activities that were of people of both with and without disabilities. A lot of this would relate to as well. So physical activity increasing, knowledge increasing, and then that leading after a period of time, if they're continuing to enjoy activities, to overall physical fitness and health increasing, to increases in self-confidence and self-esteem, and then that leading them to be able to get better quality jobs and roles in the community. But also there should be an arrow coming down here that I think I've missed, which would also help them to have the confidence to increase their interaction within their communities. That's a big part of Spirit's work, is that connectedness as well, and leading to a healthier and happier life. And then we had a chain here, which I think might also be missing an arrow, with people with a disability getting increased levels of support from family, friends, and NGOs, and all of that leading to this increase in knowledge and interaction and positive interaction, and misconceptions being dispelled. And finally, that would lead over to the right here to an increase in visibility of people with a disability in society, and being seen in a positive light, their abilities being recognized, and more positive attitudes and behavior towards people with a disability. And then finally, that they're then able to, people with a disability are able to realize their potential and more fully contribute to community and wider society. And then finally, across the bottom, we've got a range, and there are many of these. We just pick some out of the longer outcomes needed in wider society, so that there are opportunities available for leadership and volunteering, that there's a better quality or of provision, of inclusive provision of high quality sports in schools. There's access to employment, educational opportunities. There's a wider adoption of child protection policies and practices, and an improvement in government policies for ensuring equal rights for people with a disability. It's just a respect that actually, or respecting the fact that change also needs to occur in a wider system, and that could be related to the advocacy piece as well. So we will share this with you afterwards, but this all comes from the NGOs that we worked with. it's just our combination of their work into this model. Please feel free to write in any comments for as you have been doing already, which is great. So we already have some feedback that it could be considered that it might create a more positive attitude towards physical activity, which is a nice one, which I don't think we have here. So you'll feel free to continue writing any comments in here. It's very useful to us, but we will send this out to you as well. And it will be the focus of the final webinar. So each of these webinars will strengthen this. So we've got a lot to add in from the inclusive webinar, from the advocacy webinar. So you'll kind of have a summary of all of these webinars in one place. But it helps us today. And so we're going to give my voice a break in a moment and come to our guest presenter for today, because what this also helps us to do is just to ground us in where we're focusing today on the experience sharing from Spirit. And we're going to be focused firstly on really the more positive, the changes, more positive attitudes in and behavior, and changes in perception and attitudes. So broadly, what Amy will be referring to would come in to this section here on our theory of change towards the longer term outcomes in wider society. And then a bit later, we're going to be focused over on the left here at some of the outputs and the measurement of the number of people with a disability that the projects are working with. So this would be a great point to start to bring in Amy, and we're going to start just with actually coming back up to the top left here, and just a bit about the work of Spirit, just to give you an introduction to Spirit and to Amy, and then we'll move into their feedback and their experiences of grantees measuring outcomes. So Amy, if I could come over to you.
Great. Hi everyone. Thank you very much, Tom. Yeah, so Spirit of 2012 was set up to recreate the kind of sense of pride and positivity that came out of the London Olympic and Paralympic Games. And in terms of the Paralympic Games, I think that there was a real feeling by lots of people in the UK, including the founders at Spirit, that the Paralympic Games were a kind of step change for how people with disabilities were viewed in the UK, although that's not without its problems actually, and some there's been some critiques of that as well, but how can we continue that? They were really, really well attended, really well viewed, kind of high profile role models that were on show there. So how could we continue that as part of what we funded? So our funding is across the UK on projects that bring people together, people with and without disabilities, take part in positive activity, and a lot of that is sports based. So a wide range of projects around getting the least active people active, which disproportionately affects people with disabilities, and then also some kind of role model stuff as well, kind of how can we give people who have barriers to access, how can we remove those barriers? I think that's kind of the main things to say on Spirit itself, and then in terms.
Sure. Oh, yeah. I'm just going to bring that up. Sorry, Amy. I think it's my presentation has skipped ahead, so let me just come back to which it does this sometimes. So let me just get back to the right point into the outcomes bit. Sorry about this. Okay, got it.
Yeah. So in terms of our impact statement, we focus on three main things. The first one is health and well-being, so improving well-being through all the participatory activities that we do. And then the most important one for this is improving perceptions and attitudes towards disability and impairment. And that we've actually recently added in a bit around including self-perceptions. So some of it is around making sure both organisations and institutions and the wider public don't have limiting perceptions of people with disabilities, but also that people with disabilities themselves feel empowered to take part in activities at every level, as participants, as volunteers, as leaders. And then the third bit of our impact statement is around cohesion and community cohesion and understanding. So we also have an outcomes, a theory of change with kind of outcomes framework, and what you're seeing here is on screen is the disability section of that. So this was kind of mapping how we see change happening. So it's probably a little bit too detailed to go into here, but you can see the mix of things in the centre around disabled people themselves, overcoming self-limiting beliefs, but also the real importance of decreasing stigma and prejudice, which happens when people can interact together and learn from each other. Tom, is there anything else you wanted me to say about that, the outcomes framework?
No, that's all good. That's all good. As you say, it'd be tricky to get into all the detail of it, but just to show that there's a whole, that you have that whole range of outcomes leading up to the longer term outcome. And I know that's you've got that's shareable too, isn't it? Because that's that's a part of your public theory of change too, if people are interested.
It is, yeah. So you can kind of see from that it's pretty complicated things to measure, and how we work as a trust is that we like to support. We recognise all projects that kind of have different aims and are going to be working at different scales as well. But we, when we were setting up, wanted to collaborate on a set of outcome measures that people could choose the most relevant ones to them from, so that they were asking at the beginning of their interaction and at the end. And the two main questions in the disability theme that we asked were on your screen here. So thinking about disabled people in general, how much of the time, if at all, do you think they can lead as full a life as non-disabled people? All of the time, most of the time, some of the time, rarely or never. And generally speaking, do you think there is a lot of prejudice in Britain against disabled people? A lot, a little, hardly any, none, don't know. And those were questions taken from the British Social Attitude Survey. So we wanted to collect questions that had already been validated, that are in public surveys, that projects could compare themselves against national UK statistics on them, but they're not perfect, as you'll see from when we started to try and use them. So then some projects that are looking at this in more detail ask a few more questions. So all projects, we started off asking all projects to ask those first two, because whatever we were funding, we wanted there to be an element of making sure that people with disabilities were able to participate as equals and see what the effect was on that. So some organisations that were really focusing on that in detail asked some further questions, which are on your screen now. To what extent do you think disabled people are affected in their daily lives by the following issues? Would you say your view of disabled people was positive or negative before this project or event? And then a kind of comparison, one from that, of whether it has changed by the end of the activity. And then that bottom section, really, really important, a number of questions around I have a stake in society, I can influence my community, and things like that, which we ask not just of people with disabilities, but people who have barriers to full participation in this sort of activity. So that might be young people, that might be people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and things like that. But wanting to understand specifically for people with disabilities how that's changed. I have a stake in society by participating in the project was really important as well.
Great, and I think, Amy, but this is one of those things that, you know, when you're really into these creating these presentations, you realize, I just realized I haven't checked. I think some of them are from the current attitudes towards disabled people, maybe, but I'm not. It was one thing I meant to check, but there are quite a few similar questions within that guide, so I wanted to include it anyway because it could be very useful to the group.
Yeah, and interestingly, that guide goes further into asking some questions which people might feel quite uncomfortable about asking. So things around, they have questions such as, would you feel uncomfortable if a disabled person was, and then your MP, your children's partner, or things like that. So really quite personal questions that Scope ask when they're trying to understand attitudes towards disabled people.
Okay, yeah, and we'll put that in the links to send out to the group because it's really interesting. That summarizes also their responses as well that they got back, which I thought was quite interesting. But I just want to jump in to highlight that I should have really checked, but I thought some were from there, but they may not have been.
I mean, it's depressing if you do read what some of the attitudes people have that question reveals. So you can see the importance of collecting research like that shows how deep-rooted some people's prejudices are. But in terms of data collection, asking questions like that is, yeah, quite tricky and quite sensitive.
Very much, and it comes neatly into then the just looking at some of the challenges that you've had.
Yeah. Yeah, so as we started rolling out these questions, we obviously got lots of feedback from our grantees who were trying to ask them in the field. So first, one major one, I think, is how do you, when you translate those questions that are asked at a national level into a project level, are they meaningful in terms of changing outcomes? So generally speaking, do you think there is a lot of prejudice in Britain against disabled people? At a national level, you'd be hoping for that to go down over time as prejudice decreases, perhaps. But what we were finding with some of our projects was that was going up, which was worrying at some level. But then as we started to unpick it, what we're finding is lots of people without disabilities had come to the project with quite blasé views, and then who didn't know or claim not to know many disabled people in their lives. When they'd taken part in the project, which was when they were regularly meeting and making friends with people with disabilities and had heard their experiences, they were actually realizing that that there was a lot of prejudice. So they were then saying that they were increasing their knowledge of the amount of prejudice. So that data kind of didn't mean very much whether or not it had gone up or down. You could put a positive or negative spin on it either way. So it was really hard for projects to interpret whether they were having a positive effect. And then there were some problems with comprehension of the questions, particularly, as it says here, young people with intellectual disabilities. They're quite difficult questions to get your head round, and so having parents or carers completing the questions, which means that you're not actually getting the views of people with disabilities themselves, which I think is really, again, problematic from a research point of view if the people whose lives you're wanting to improve through the project aren't getting a chance to influence and shape the research and say their views. So those were a couple of big ones. And then kind of on a fundamental level, what you're kind of doing here is separating people with and without disabilities into distinctive groups and othering them. And the way the questions read, it seems like they're assuming that you don't have a disability, and you're being asked about you know, say the one about can you lead as full a life as normal, well, that's kind of assuming that you don't have that disability. So disabled people who are answering the questions were saying to us that they actually felt it was putting them in a box and suggesting that they were being done to by the project rather than kind of doing an active participants. So that was a really important bit of feedback for us, but pretty hard to know what to do with in terms of being able to separate out people with disabilities and people without disabilities, and whose views could you see if they had different views between those two groups? Did that matter? And then yeah, people not identifying with being disabled. I think this is an important one because it was leading some projects to say, well, I know they're disabled or they have a disability, but they've not ticked the box on the form. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but I think some people feel that they are have a disability in a certain context. And then a neat example of this might be my sister, who is dyslexic, for the purposes of applying for student loans and things like that in the UK, she had a disability that needed to be declared. She got extra support for things like proofreading and things while she was a student, but she wouldn't identify as being disabled in every single context. And actually, if you were counting in inverted commas her as someone who is disabled in the context of our projects and their reach, you wouldn't really be reaching the right sort of people to be reaching her in a sports project for people with barriers to sport, for instance. So it's really, really personal, and for some reason, even I don't want to generalize with people with dyslexia either. I'm talking specifically about her experience there. So it's something that is socially constructed and really, really personal. So if you're in a situation where you're not able to self-identify as disabled and you're having someone else put that label on you, that really might not be appropriate and is quite problematic for research like this.
Great, thank you. And the other thing, just before we get to the exercise, the other aspect we're just going to talk through, ask you to just talk a little bit about. So we're talking now about more quantitative approaches and more standardized questions, but a number of your grantees I know have taken more creative, qualitative approaches, and there was just one to bring in and mention here. If you're able to just talk a little bit about what Making Roots have been up to, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So Making Roots is actually an arts rather than a sports project. It's a creative festival. And what they did really is take the questions that we had proposed and deconstructed them as a group. So it was qualitative research based around some of those quantitative questions. So they had a creative evaluation that had several elements. One of them is this thing that they called puffing and wooling, which was relaxed kind of conversations to capture attitudes and reflections from the making of the festivals, with artists with disabilities who'd taken part, with parents and project participants with and without disabilities who'd taken part, and think about the experience of putting on these artist residents and festivals and what that showed about disability. So they produced, so it's kind of a relaxed environment, and puffing and wooling, you make that kind of little pig thing that's on the screen. It's kind of a knitting type activity in a room with cushions, with safe space to discuss these kind of issues, and they captured all that in a booklet which is really, really rich in detail around how the different personalities had responded to the inclusion aspects of this project.
And there were a couple of other images of that, and I've just lost my presentation, so I will just bring that back. Prezi, while I love Prezi, does have a habit of sending you in a strange direction. So let me just bring this back up. There were just some interesting images just relating to what you were just mentioning now. I've just shared my screen again, just around the puffing and wooling.
Yeah, and you'll be able to access this whole, they've published their whole little booklet that they made on this. So I think one of the things that really comes through this is it's not one size fits all, which is really obvious. People with disabilities aren't a homogenous group, so their reflections on where the project needed to be, perceptions, languages, attitudes, was very varied, but pretty positive in terms of how the project had managed that personal approach.
Great, thank you. And as you said, Amy, we picked everything in this webinar as public access, so we'll make sure there's a link to this in the materials as well. It's really interesting. Great. Well, what we'll do now, so thank you, Amy. Amy will come back in to take a look at some experiences of measuring outputs, but thank you, Amy, for that first presentation. Much appreciated. And we'll come now just to our first exercise today, and just see if we can get some views from the group. And so what we'd like to know from you all, and if you do have your hand raised, it's a bit tricky to bring you in until the Q&A to speak, just to keep us to time. But if you do have your hand raised, if you do type in a question, sometimes, as you can see, we can sort of fit those in as we go. But what I'd like you to do, to have a think about, is what data collection tools, methods and tools do you use, or that you would recommend for collecting, and we're thinking of outcome data. So for any of these outcomes bullet pointed or in the boxes to the left, are you using questionnaires? If so, what type of questionnaire? Are you using focus groups or more qualitative tools? Are there tools or indicator frameworks that you would recommend more generally out there that we could perhaps map against our theory of change and share with the wider group? So if you could type those into the question box, and for my team as well, Catherine and Sneh, please feel free to add these in too. And I've had my research team looking at different frameworks as well, which we're going to share with you after the call. But this is about it's a bit of a I forget the term, but it's all about getting the knowledge from the group. And we've got 50 people on this call, many of you listening back, that I'm sure that there are other tools out there that we could reference, or any just generally, if you're you could share via the question box just what you're collecting, if you're one of the, I think 43% on this call who are running activities directly on the ground. That would be very interesting to know. So we'll just give a minute for you all to note that down, those of you who'd like to input, and we'll start to bring them up. We'll be using our brainstorming tool called Linoit in a moment to bring these up on the screen and share with the group, and we'll be compiling this after the call. I did note also that Catherine on the call from UNESCO, is part of our organising group, did mention to me, what about the Commonwealth project? There's a indicator framework recently developed for the Commonwealth at more of a government level, and I really should know that, because that's in Focus that developed it. This is not then in this webinar, but that would be one to reference. It's open access to, that we will reference in the materials. So I'll just keep myself quiet for a minute, just to start to get some responses in, and just prepare our little brainstorming screen. So I'll be back in about a minute's time, and we'll start to share responses from the group. Okay, we may as well get started, because we've got lots of really good feedback, interesting feedback coming in. May not be able to bring you in to speak, just to keep us to time, but we will be getting a selection of you, perhaps some 6 to 7 responses here to drop into the board, and we're going to show you, because we won't be able to hear from everybody, but we will be taking all this feedback and including it in the follow-up to this webinar. So that's going to be a big chunk of my weekend, I think, is to pull all this together. So let me just share my screen again, and you can see a tool. It's called Linowit. It's going to pop up on your screen. Those of you new to our webinars, this is where it's a free tool. I've been using it for years. I'm yet to find a better one, and it just allows you to drop these little post-it notes onto the screen. You can't get rid of the tags, unfortunately, but that you can see some of our previous organizations we work with there. But we've got lots of responses, so let's start to drop them into the call and onto the board, and we'll pick maybe 5 or 6. And I don't have what I normally do is print out the list of organizations and all your names so I can say where you're from. I can't do that today. I'm traveling and I haven't managed been able to print that off, so I'll just be able to say your name. Unfortunately not where the organization you're from, but at least recognize who's given the feedback. So let's I'm just going randomly through the list, and let's start with Daniel and Daniel Minot. So Daniel's mentioned, and I will add this up to the screen, maybe make that a bit smaller so you can see. Daniel's mentioned, so we try and stay away from the questionnaire when it comes to working with people with a disability. We tend to use a coach's checklist instead, as young people don't want to fill these out. On the other hand, we find using video recording to be quite useful, as it gives a chance for them to speak, which they find easier. And what I would say to you, Daniel, as I'd say to anybody feeding back, if you have any kind of any details, especially with the video recording, would be really interesting. If you've got any reports or guides or tools that you could share, that would be awesome. No problem if not, but I think particularly on the video recording side, that's a really interesting way of recording that data, quite slightly not unusual necessarily, but a bit different from questionnaires. We'd love to hear a bit more about that. So thank you, Daniel. If we come to, let's come to Naomi next. So Naomi, you've mentioned that, so it's Naomi Brill, you've mentioned that you use mostly surveys, so it's online, paper-based, or over the phone. And then you have alternative versions for people with more complex learning difficulties or disabilities. So using a emoji paddleboard for simple yes, no, happy, sad questions, but that only works if it's in person. It's really interesting. And also case study interviews that Naomi is using. I'm just flicking down through your responses, Naomi, as I go. A final point there from Naomi, it's really important to make the evaluation as inclusive as possible. So everything should be in plain English and use words instead of numbers on scales to make it clear and easy to understand. Brilliant. Okay, so just drop that in. And same, I guess same question to you, Naomi, as Daniel. If there's anything you can share with us on this too, that'd be great. I think especially with the emoji paddleboards, that's really interesting to you know, to give as an option to other organizations would be really interesting too. So thank you, Naomi. We'll come now to Johan Massot. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Johan's mentioned that they collect in the places where there's a durable activity between disabled and not disabled together. So taking this position that the activity bringing joy from playing and being a durable way to link people in society. So that would be data collection from the activities we mentioned in the theory of change earlier, where those with and without disabilities are engaging together, which is quite a common approach. And if we come next, so thank you, Johan, for your input. And we'll come to Linda Monaghan. And Linda's mentioned that they use mainly surveys and tick the box questionnaires, but find them to not give any extra ideas or information which we struggle with. So thank you, Linda. and we'll come now to, and this is always challenge for me. So if I go a bit quiet, it's because I'm reading it out while finding the next response. Ironically, for running these webinars, multitasking is not always my strong point, but I do my best. So if we could come to Aysegul, and I should really check I'm pronouncing your name correctly, because Aysegul, you come on all our webinars. You've been on all 3 of these, I know, and give some great feedback. So I really need to make sure I'm getting your name, pronouncing your name correctly. Apologies if not. So Aysegul mentioned they're using semi-structured interviews and qualitative research methods, and asking people's own opinion. So this can be people with disabilities, but it can also be teachers, principals and parents and siblings. It can be peers and classmates. So I'll just add this to our board, and that brings in definitely would. It's quite common that and it's good to mention this. So we're not just thinking here of data collection from people with a disability. We're thinking of going more widely than that, and also what data is collected from teachers, principals, parents, and siblings, as Aysegul has mentioned here. Okay, and we'll come maybe just to 1 or 2 more before we go back to our presentation, and we do have another exercise coming up a bit later as well. So I'll just flick down the list, and I'm picking quite randomly from it. So if we could come to Viniscus, so welcome onto the webinar. I know you've also been on several of these, and I should also really hoping I've pronounced your name correctly, or an approximation of your name. I'm hoping it's reasonably close. But Viniscus has mentioned, who is from Fight for Peace Brazil, is mentioned in his response here. So he's mentioned that Fight for Peace use questionnaires with validated scales regarding physical improvement and other sorts of life skills like problem solving, communication, and then also individual in-depth interviews and case studies about perceptions on disabilities, such as the extent of awareness and impact. So thank you, Viniscus. And as with the others, if you were happy to share that by email, that'd be great, but I completely understand if not. Ron has mentioned too, Ron Peck, that parental feedback is a great indication of level of success. So I would definitely agree. And as Aysegul has mentioned too, quite important to get a wider, to get information and triangulate and get information from different sources, not just from people with a disability. And I'll come finally to, it's Aysegul. So I think I was close. So thank you for that guidance. I'm going to practice, but I normally, before a webinar, I list all the participants. I look up pronunciations, but again, with traveling, I've not been able to do that. So any guidance you give, if I'm not getting your name quite right, is very much appreciated. But we'll come finally to Sneh from Indibility, who's part of our organising group, as I mentioned earlier. And so I'll give Sneh the final say, but I'll be summing up all the input for anyone who has fed in just after this webinar. So Sneh has mentioned, so they collect feedback on the interventions from the beneficiaries in the village that they work with in the adult community, and then publish that in the flyer that's distributed through the village during a publicity run. When our image volunteers with disabilities go out to the villages to inform people about the next session, people love to be heard and are therefore very willing to take part, and it's become a valuable part of the M&E process. And it helps also Indibility to find out how the non-disabled community are responding to volunteers with disabilities as well. So there's a bit there about how the data then is used as well. So brilliant, thank you, Sneh. So in our rather colourful feedback there, I think we managed to use a distinct colour for each one. Don't always manage to do that, but so we've got some great feedback there, much appreciated. Gives you an idea of the range of what's being used, and certainly also some of the innovation that's coming out there as well. and just gives us a sense of what information is being collected as well. So really appreciate all that feedback. Sorry if we didn't get to your feedback, but we will as I said, be summing that up and sharing it after the call. And so we will have one more exercise today. I think hopefully going to be a really interesting one. What we'll do now is just come back into our presentation. We'll be hearing from Amy and then from Catherine just before we come into our final exercise that we're going to do as a group. So I'll just pause the screen and come back in to the presentation and just introduce this next part. So you should be seeing this back up on your screen. We're still in the main part of the presentation, the main screen here, and we're going to come back into our mini theory of change here. And we're now going to, we were looking at some of the outcomes and the experiences with the measurement of those outcomes with Amy. We're now going to come to outputs, and specifically here, outputs relating to the number of people with a disability that are actually working on or part of a project. What we're going to need to do, because Catherine's got to leave a bit early, which is no problem, Catherine. So what we'll do is just bring in a little bit about the group of questions that have been created called by the Washington Group to measure the individual or people that have disabilities. So we're going to switch around the order, if that's okay, Amy, as well. We're going to just move ahead a little bit and come into that description. And then we're going to just come back to Amy and the spirit experiences before we go into our final exercise. So Catherine, could I bring you in just to introduce these questions? So again, we're looking now at the measurement of just purely the number of people with disabilities that are engaged in a particular project, and this Washington Group of questions is a way of measuring disability. So Catherine, could I think you might be self-muted. Would I? I think you're going to join us. So hopefully we've got a couple of minutes with you before you need to go. But thanks for jumping in.
Yes, Tom, no problem. Thank you very much for facilitating that. Yeah, I just wanted to mention in relation to questions and monitoring and evaluation and research in relation to the area of disability, some work that has been done by the United Nations Statistical Commission on the basis of the fact, I suppose, that there is a difficulty internationally around gathering data in the area of disability. I think we all know that there's a data gap globally around internationally comparable data in the area of disability inclusion, and especially in and through sport and physical activity. So around that, the UN Statistical Commission set up a Washington Group, and the Washington Group produced this short set of questions that were designed originally to be used in census, but also in surveys around the area of disability inclusion. It addresses three main issues really around the difficulties associated with looking at disability in research and in broad scale census. Sometimes there are difficulties in asking questions to people around describing their particular experience with disability or particular maybe disability type or classification. So that was problematic for people. Secondly, you have people who don't necessarily identify as having a disability. So that's something that resulted in maybe some misinformation in survey instruments and census type information. And thirdly, there was a requirement to look at the area of functional limitations that the WHO, the World Health Organization, would recommend. So looking at what functional limitations a person may have aligned with the International Classification of Function. So the UN Statistical Commission came up with the Washington Group of questions. They have a short set, a long set, and a number of other resources that are continually being developed through this group to help address these queries. And they're primarily for use in census, but have a much broader application in research as well. And they get over those kind of key things: the difficulty with asking questions about disability according to your laws and policy, the fact that people don't always identify as having a defined disability, and the fact that we really need to know more about functional limitations so as we can provide services, monitor functional difficulties that people may have, and assess the equality of opportunity that people with disabilities have in accessing services and programs and other things that may be available. So addressing human rights issues that people may have. So globally, this lack of internationally comparable data is being addressed by the process that you mentioned there earlier through the Commonwealth work, which is all aligned to the implementation of Kazan Action Plan, which is a UNESCO, well, it originated as a UNESCO action plan. It's now an action plan for everybody to look at trying to have universal access for all to physical education, sport, recreation and fitness areas. So there's a lot of ongoing work and momentum now about gathering this data internationally, and the more coherent the mechanisms people are using to gather the data, the easier it'll be for us to find this internationally comparable data that will then be of use for human rights reasons, for increasing resources and investment in services that may be required to bring about the equality that we're all seeking in this area. So the Washington Group questions are very promising in that regard and very useful to try and find out that information that at the moment we know is absent internationally.
Great, thank you, Catherine, much appreciated. And thanks for jumping in. It's quite short notice when I asked you if you would mind coming in to mention that. I have got a quick question to you. Yep. So if that's okay, and then a quick sort of comment to bring in. Have you got time, Catherine? Because I know you have to.
Absolutely, yeah.
Is that all right? So I know we have a Q&A at the end, but it just while you're here. So this is from Viniscus from Fight for Peace. So he's asked, to what extent the signature of the International Convention will guide national governments to adjust basic health, data collection in health services, national research, and/or census, for example.
Yeah. So there's quite a lot of momentum at the moment around addressing the data gap that's out there and encouraging countries to come to a unified approach to gathering the data that's needed in order to address the issues in relation to human rights and access to health, education, sport, and other areas. I would see the Kazan Action Plan at the moment is gaining momentum as the pivotal instrument, which is asking for this data as well. And it is currently this month being considered at the UN General Assembly. And with that in mind, countries are being asked to consider amending their census information and other large-scale population studies that they engage in, maybe national sports monitor information or other information like that, to align them with mechanisms such as the Washington Short Group's questions, or the information that Tom, you mentioned earlier in relation to the tools and model indicators that are being developed through the Commonwealth process at the moment, so as we can have a much better picture in order to inform much better investments and actions at the country level to respond to inequity that we know is out there in relation to people with disabilities' opportunity for engagement in sport and physical activity.
Great, thank you. So I hope that helps. Vanessa said, yeah, thanks a lot, Catherine. We'll follow up on that debate to also align our tools to some of the agreed scales and categories. And then we've just got also a couple of other comments I think would be good to bring in at this point. Ollie Dudfield is actually with us from the Commonwealth Secretariat as well. So welcome to the call, Ollie, too. And so Ollie's just has mentioned here, just adding to Catherine's points, the work on developing model indicators to measure the contribution of sport to the SDGs, which for information is primarily aimed at policymakers and governing organisations or networks, has drawn on the work of the Washington Group on Disability Statistics and the short set of 6 questions to support appropriate desegregation of the data. So thank you, Ollie, and great to have you on the call too. Again, as I mentioned earlier on the call, as Catherine and I were discussing beforehand, given it's my team working on that with you, we've not really brought that into this webinar, but we'll certainly be sharing anything we can share just after in the follow-up to the webinar as well. So I'm glad you both jumped in to mention that work, which is really exciting, and hopefully that gives the group on the call and those of you listening back just an idea of what's going on internationally and some of the latest work that's occurring. And we also Daniel has mentioned as well, Daniel Minert. So just a quick comment on the Washington questions. So he's mentioned as a young person with a disability himself, he would answer no to all of those we've got on the screen here, as it doesn't relate to his disability, which is ASD. I would say too, and I'm not an expert in the questions by any means, but I know there are a short set and there are a longer set as well. We're just showing the short set here. So it'd be interesting to know if that longer set addressed addressed a wider set of disabilities. That would be interesting to explore. That's probably the limit to which I can feedback on that. But thank you, Daniel. No, it's interesting to know, and I don't think too there will be a perfect tool out there. I think that's one of the conclusions we'll come to from this webinar, is there's also no ideal way of measuring this type of work. We certainly can't present sort of solutions on this webinar, more discussion points. Katarina Schulte mentioned the longer set of questions would most likely address that, Daniel. So it would be well worth taking a look at that longer set. I can certainly send some links out after the webinar, but that's what we're here to do. We're here to challenge and to respond. It's great to get this bit of dialogue going back and forth between you all. Is great. So thank you to Catherine, who I know has to drop off. Much appreciated to jump in there. And thanks also to Vaniscus, to Ollie, Daniel, and Katerina, just for jumping in for that exchange there too. And Ollie, it'd be good to get in touch afterwards and just see what we can share at this stage with the group before I feed back to them next week on the Commonwealth project. So I know the internal details. I'm not fully up to date on what can be shared more publicly. So it'd be great to touch base with you on that too. Great. Well, we've gone in a slightly different order here, just to catch Catherine before she needs to go. So what I'd really like to do is to now relate, just go back to some of Amy's experiences of Spirit, which very much relate to this discussion, just around some of the challenges of measuring outputs in this area. So I'm going to just come back a little bit back in the presentation, and then if Amy, I could ask you to come in, and then we have a final exercise today before we finish. So and Catherine, do feel free to drop off, and thanks again for jumping in. Amy, so over to you. It'd be great to now, we were looking at perhaps some of the potential solutions there. It would be great to, in a slightly different order now, come back to some of the challenges that you've had at Spirit, if I could bring you in here.
Yeah, so obviously one of the things that's really important to us in reporting to our board and making sure that we're really accountable is being able to say how many disabled people with disabilities we're actually meeting through our projects as a proportion, and as a total figure and as a proportion. And that's it's not just because our board wants to hear like big numbers and things, but I think that without knowing that, you could be saying, oh yeah, we were set up to reach people with disabilities, but did you know that we've only met 3% out of all of our beneficiaries have a disability and things like that. So that raw number is something that's really important for us. And we wanted that as a single question for our project beneficiaries to answer, so that if you think demographics are already stretching to several questions to understand. So we had two options for that, which were, do you consider yourself to have a disability or long-term health condition? Or are your day-to-day activities limited because of a health problem or disability that has lasted or is likely to last at least 12 months? And again, these are the sort of questions that are on things like the Community Life Survey and things like that in the UK. But these questions definitely aren't perfect, and some of the reasons we've kind of already discussed around that. So yeah, so we subscribe to the social model of disability, which is basically saying that people are disabled by society, not because they themselves, I guess, are disabled, if that makes sense. So that causes, as it says here, additional issues for the sporting world projects that we have, because classification for events is really, really important. So some of the sporting projects that we run were saying that they were underreporting because people might have disabilities, but were able to participate in, say, mainstream athletics rather than Paralympic athletics, so they weren't reporting themselves as having a disability on surveys. Other problems with underreporting might be, as we discussed, because people don't recognise that they have a disability or identify as disabled in different contexts. And it also lumps people with disabilities together as a homogenous group rather than kind of being a little bit more sensitive to some of the things that they might, their needs that might be actually affecting why they can attend or participate fully in events. I think one example, I'm in Hull at the moment, where I've been in meetings about the City of Culture programme, and one of the questions that they noticed is that people were saying that they were very limited in their day-to-day life. So people that answered, are your day-to-day activities limited because of health problems? And those that were saying very limited were underrepresented in the participants from the City of Culture. Well, at first that looks like a problem for the City of Culture, that they events that they haven't been reaching people whose lives are very limited by disabilities. But because of the way the question is asked, it's kind of implicit in the question that if you answer that your life is very limited rather than somewhat limited, participation in arts and culture is one of the ways that you're very limited. So it doesn't help the City of Culture understand what they're doing to reach out to people.
Great, thank you, Amy. And the idea was then we were coming into the section then on the Washington Group questions, which were a way of asking about disability without going into specific impairments. But we've done it in a slightly different way around. But I thought, because Amy and I had quite a few, we work closely with Spirit, and we've had discussions around this area, the degree to which to ask about levels of impairment or not, or just how to ask about disability more generally. And it then generated all kinds of really interesting discussions with the group organising this webinar. So with the disability experts, Catherine, Amy, Eli, Snay, feeding into this webinar. So we thought it's really interesting way of generating some debate, and then introducing, as Catherine and then Ollie did from the Commonwealth, just some of the global work going into this area. So really appreciate you coming in today, Amy, just to share your experiences. And what this will lead us into now is the final exercise for today. And it's a bit ambitious. I don't know whether yeah, how this will work, we'll see. Vaniskas, you also mentioned here as well just to Amy and to us, and we're kind of doing the Q&A as we go a bit on the fly here, but it's all relevant, so it's quite nice to bring in. You've mentioned it'd be interesting if participants were prompted to share, and in focus as well, ways to collect and classify their target groups, so levels, types, etc., to help each other to build this this capacity. And we will be doing that. We'll be coming on to that, just emailing out after the webinar to ask if the wider group, again, there's 40 or 50 on this webinar, there are this wider group of about 250 that have signed up so far this year. So it's a great, really interesting group to ask. So we will be following up this webinar by asking sort of what would they be happy to share what they're collecting, both on an output and outcome side, so we can start to share that to map against our theory of change and hopefully really provide a lot more value. So we will certainly be asking that. What I'd like to do now is just come to our final exercise, and this builds on the experiences that Spirit have had here. It builds on the also the Washington Group questions and Catherine's discussion and Ollie's input into that too, just on the collection of data regarding specific impairments, specific types of disability. And what I would really like to understand from the group, and this may or may not work, we're here to be ambitious on these calls, so we will see, but it would be great to understand from you all, what are some of the benefits and challenges of going into more detail on the types of impairments. So for example, one of the benefits might be that you can get a better understanding whether certain groups are, a term we might use in the UK is underserved. I don't necessarily love that term, but are not getting as much support. People with certain types of disability, perhaps, or certain types of impairment. But one of the challenges might be what Amy is related to, the challenge in actually collecting that data, whether people would be willing to provide it. So it'd be great to understand. We're going to bring up our board in a moment, just to ask you to feed in, and to if you could put benefit or challenge, just type that in at the start of your answer so we know which one you're referring to, and we'll start to bring some of those together onto the screen. So I will just keep quiet for a minute just to let some responses come in, and then we'll see how this works. It's always quite challenging to do this kind of debate on a call like this, but it would be interesting to try. So I will keep quiet for a minute and bring up the exercise board, and then start to bring in any responses that come in. So already getting some great responses in, so which is brilliant. So we can start to bring these in a moment, but really appreciate the feedback coming in. So we definitely have enough to run this exercise, which is brilliant. So we'll give it another well, actually there's no reason actually now to wait, because we've got lots of feedback coming in, so we will start to bring that into the call, and we'll may have to stick to the messages. We'll see how many we get in. If we have time, we'll leave anybody raising their hand, we'll try to come to at the end, so after dropping in the messages. So best way to input would be to type in, but we will try to get to anybody with their hands raised if we have some time once we've dropped in the responses, which are really interesting so far. So I'll just share my screen. We're back on our brainstorm here, and I'll go in order that they've come in. So one, I think, Naomi, this, if I've read this in the right way, so one of the challenge would be that a lot of people, it's from Naomi Brill, so a lot of people have multiple disabilities. And we found that in other work we're doing at the moment with, it's a little outside of disability, though that comes into it, where we're trying to measure sort of again, for want of a better term, of hard to reach groups that are underserved. And one of the feedbacks there is definitely that's very challenging to measure and to reach those people when they have multiple challenges. So I could imagine that being the same when I have multiple disabilities, to record on a form. So we will drop that one in and move that to the challenge side, and we'll come now to Alyssa. So one of the benefits of measuring this is then there are more awareness of different types of disabilities, and that's actually starting in its own way to normalize that in disability in society. So we'll just drop that in on the benefits side. I'm keen to avoid, we'll use colors for each side. I always try and avoid using red and green for necessarily negatives. So there we go. More awareness of different types of disabilities, so that in itself can normalize disability in society. I find it really interesting from a monitoring evaluation point of view, because I'm a big advocate that often in conducting an evaluation can be a great point for learning, that even questions in a questionnaire can teach people, regardless of how they respond. I think is always really interesting. So I definitely agree. Whether I agree or not is not important, but just from my own experience, I would agree. So then Abby has mentioned another benefit, which would be understanding the impairment type can help to drive or prioritize certain sports programs forward. That might be for, I guess, for a specific impairment that might identify where there's a need for certain activities, if I've interpreted that correctly. So thank you, Abby. That was from Abby Fines. And then we've got a challenge here. And I always mangle the pronunciation of this name. I think it's Ashling, if I've pronounced that correctly. Ashling has mentioned that as Amy already outlined, that the difficulty related to whether people identify having a disability or not, and this leads to then some difficulty with comparing internationally, which is certainly, yeah, Amy alluded to that earlier in her discussion, that with having that challenge, Spirit having that challenge in the UK, and then could understand why that would then also occur at a global level. And actually, I did get your name right. That is great. So I'm pleased to hear. So we'll then come to it's a different name to the person writing in, but that's fine. And I definitely will struggle with your name, and I'm sorry, but I think it's Saint Pyong, from Play On Side in Thailand. And you've mentioned some of the main challenges with recording multiple impairments or different impairments would be communication of that, the understanding of it, the attention span, I guess, to go through those different impairments, and can certainly be a challenge. You've also mentioned some benefits as well. So let me just drop those in too. So really interesting responses, and great that they're coming from all around the world as well. So yeah, also feel free to list your organization and country at the start if you would like to. And you've mentioned too some benefits, and that would be to give them a chance to speak and describe their reality. So that would be I guess an opportunity to explain their I mean, it depends how this is being recorded, I guess, whether it's a checklist or whether they're given an open it's an open text box to describe that, but it's I guess a chance to be much more specific and describe how their own their impairments. So thank you for that. So from Viniscus, we've got some benefits here. So a better understanding of the target group's needs to then design projects accordingly, which is great. That's starting to overlap with the earlier comment too. So I just drop that in. So, and that I can really understand being one of the key benefits. Again, as I mentioned, it might be that certain people with certain impairments are potentially not getting the same level of support as others, or it could be to which extent target groups are also aware of their disabilities and impairments. So it might actually tell you or start to tell you, about the degree to which, the target audience is, I guess, understand the impairments that they may have, or it could tell you about their knowledge in that respect too. And also that Viniscus mentioned a cross-reference that with internal staff capacity to then address needs and to foster partnerships with local organizations that can then provide joint efforts. So again, it's using that knowledge to improve or increase provision, being a key benefit. So thank you, Viniscus, much appreciated. And if we come now to Alyssa, and a challenge, and I love the way you're all balancing your challenges and benefits quite nicely here at the moment. Much appreciated. So you've mentioned that there's no one size fits all when asking questions about types of impairments. Again, it's that point that many people have more than one, have multiple disabilities, so difficult to get that list right and get that right globally, which again, I was not involved with the Washington questions, but I can understand the need for a set of questions that don't necessarily name the particular impairments, given that globally they might be described differently as well. Wasn't quite your point, Alyssa, but I take the point about, no one size fits all when asking questions about impairment and with people with multiple impairments or disabilities. And if I just could come now to the next response. So Aishagul, I'm practicing your name, so I'm hoping it's improving. So my pronunciation. So you've mentioned some of the benefits for better understanding, better inclusion, better individualized physical education programs, better awareness, so from people's public understanding of impairments, and better generally training programs as a result of understanding the different types of impairments. So that's another benefit, just to add to the right here. And so thank you for that. And we're going to try and get to everybody here if we can. We've got lots and lots of responses, so we're going to leave a little bit of time at the end for also for Q&A. So we may not get to everybody, but we'll certainly be writing this up afterwards. But we're going to try, because there's some great stuff here. So from Steve Weaver, you've mentioned a benefit being the ability to be as specific as possible in improving one's goals by structuring activities specifically for each individual. That's Steve Weaver from Special Olympics. So again, it's about then the ability to tailor activities. I will just zoom out a little bit here to fit all these in. I was starting to group them. This would fit in this. I've got a general group up here of that ability to structure programs to address needs. So thank you, Steve. If we come now to Cara Pears or Pears, I'm not sure. So Cara mentioned the more specific information published around certain impairment groups means that we can truly evidence the need for our organization and programs as we specifically work with intellectual disability. And there's not much information generally regarding this impairment group specifically. So again, to help to identify need being really key to collect information in that area. So it's generally going in this group up to the top right here. And we've got a few more to go that we're going to come to. So Liz Twyford. So Liz mentioned a benefit. So we're not a homogeneous group. So it helps to break down the blanket disability term, as people are disabled in different ways as a result of different impairments and their interaction with different environments as well. So thank you, Liz. I'll add that to the benefit side as well. And we will just zoom out again, give ourselves a bit more room. So the benefits are outweighing the challenges. This is not by any means a study of which takes precedence here. Obviously, it's maybe that benefits come more naturally. So I wouldn't read too much into that, but some great feedback coming in. Daniel Minor, you've mentioned that it fits in both. So a lot of people you worked with in the past are very willing to tell us about impairment. This is built by trust, and a lot of charities try and get this right away at the start when trust isn't built yet. And that, yeah, it can take that trust to be able to get people to open up. So there may be a case there, Daniel, I guess, for just being asking this at the most appropriate time, I guess. So I think there's a really interesting point about timing and when, because I can quite imagine that if you've built up that relationship with the group, then they may well then be more willing to provide that information. I'm now just going to, I don't think we're going to get through, I'm just flicking through how many more we've got. Oh, I think we can, we should be able to get through everybody actually. So we've got a few more to go. So we're going to try and get through them and then still have a few minutes for questions. But we hadn't anyway left very long for Q&A on this because we're really keen to do this exercise. So some of those questions we may need to take offline that we got before the webinar, because I would really like to finish this exercise if we can, because there's still some really interesting stuff here information here to share. So Vaniscus, you also mentioned a challenge, which is the let's have a look here. So using inappropriate words and sentences that may reinforce prejudice to people with disabilities. And the prompting can also lead to increased expectations with public and staff that solutions can or will be provided. So for example, establishing a clear definition of what we mean by partial or severe when we're asking about it. So yeah, how specific you can and be when you're asking about different impairments. Thank you, Vaniscus, for that. And Johan, you've mentioned that just wondering if we shouldn't focus on what people can do instead of what they can't. So we might have the same data at the end, but already working in a positive way. So it'd then be easier to use it to build activities and content. Great. So thank you to Johan. I'm just going to add that as a more general comment. It's quite an interesting. I know organisations certainly are exploring that in terms of how to ask this in the most positive way and inclusive way possible. And one of the challenges from Aisling is that it can lead to segregation and it can lead to labelling. And I'm just now flying through these rather than any comments on each. So thank you to Aisling. And then Daniel, you've mentioned that a challenge is their understanding of their own disabilities, as some people might not actually understand that they have a disability yet. It's a really interesting point, because we talked earlier and Amy mentioned earlier that that there might be a sort of a unwillingness to provide that information, but it also, with some examples that Amy mentioned too, just around dyslexia, if it may not be that they identify themselves as having that particular disability or having that particular impairment. And then we have from Aisling, a benefit is that it could be desirable to advocate then to make political change. So that could be a way of using this information would be to get an overall picture and be able to use that for advocacy. And we've then got another challenge from Eshigal. So that is a possible reaction from people with disabilities, a lack of correct information getting from a doctor, for example, on reports, a lack of reaching the information from governments sometimes, a lack of field tests or measurement tools for people with disabilities. And we've got, I think, a couple more. We've got 2 more, so 3 more. So I'm nearly there with getting these on there, but it's giving us such a really good overview and some really interesting thoughts here. I'm very keen to get to everybody if I can. So Naomi, you've mentioned a final challenge and a benefit. Naomi Brill. So if using a checklist, this is a challenge. If using a checklist rather than a free text, which itself has some challenges around reporting when you get open questions in terms of the time it takes to pull that together. I know it's and the skills needed. It's difficult to categorize certain impairments, for example, autism. Does it fall under learning, cognitive or developmental? You may end up having a really long list of options and then making your evaluation document long. And just to add to that too, that might also make it could lead to if you know, whether they'll take the time to fill it in or to read through the list. It's always a challenge when you have a long list within a questionnaire, as we well know from developing questionnaires. And Naomi, your final benefit there is that you can then tailor the activity to meet the needs of each individual, which has come up a few times now, which is definitely, there's some consensus over that. Being able to tailor to certain needs, being able to tailor the activities to meet those needs is a really key benefit. And so we're down to our final challenge from Daniel. So Daniel, you're going to get the last word in this activity, and relates back to your previous challenge, and mainly for under 18s, is when asked to the parents, is that parents may not understand, or they may be in denial about the particular impairment that in this case that a young person may have. And so again, presents those challenges in providing that information. Brilliant. Well, thank you for that, for all of you for taking part in that exercise. You can see here we've got really comprehensive set of responses, which is very much really good quality. So it's really helpful just to get an idea. I think you can see they're they've evened out, interestingly, quite a lot. Again, I wouldn't necessarily read too much into that, given this is a quick exercise. But it's quite interesting that we've got that quite balanced set of benefits and challenges. And we were keen to note on this webinar that there are no right answers, and certainly we're not in a position to tell any of you what the right answer is here. We don't feel there is one. There are clearly benefits from measuring types of impairments. There are clearly a number of challenges with that as well. What we were keen to do was to present some of the work that Catherine did in this area with the Washington Group questions, which there is no perfect tool, there's no perfect approach. We work globally at InFocus. We know that tools that work in some area don't work in others, but we're very keen to present that work that's going on both with the Washington Group, and then also I will touch base, Ollie, if that's okay, to see what we can send out so far on the Commonwealth work and any other research we've done in this area. But I think again it does highlight that there isn't a correct answer here, that there are benefits and there are challenges, and we will write these up and get them all over to you as a group. What I would like to do now, we've only got a couple of minutes left of the webinar. We deliberately cut down on the Q&A, and I've cut down on it even more because we were getting such interesting responses through that I really wanted to include them all on the webinar. So what I would suggest is that if I could ask just, because I didn't ask you before, Amy, just whether you maybe have 5 minutes just to stick around if there's any questions from the group. If not, we can certainly pull together the questions and respond just offline. But Amy, would you have a few minutes just if there are any questions to you from your experiences at Spirit?
I'm so sorry, I don't. I'm not in my.
Oh, you're not, are you? You booked the room, haven't you?
No, I'm just in a random room here, so I think they're going to chuck me out.
Yeah, I had that in my mind actually. I should have asked beforehand, but that's fine. So I think what we'll do, Amy, is if there's any questions, if I could get them over to you by email, if that would be okay.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm really sorry about that.
No, that's fine. You did mention that, and I'd forgotten actually. So, but I just wanted to thank you for coming in and sharing some of your experiences. Just really appreciated, and feel free now to drop off. But thanks so much for coming on, and
no, thank you. And I'd really love to hear other people's experiences in this as well, because as you probably could see from our presentation, we've thrown up more problems than answers.
Yeah, but that's often the case, and that's often what's most interesting to discuss. That's why we wanted to bring that in. It rarely, it always seemed to generate a really interesting discussion. The topics that came up that you discussed. So really appreciate it, and I'll send on any questions to you as well.
Thank you.
Great. Well, so if there are any questions from the group, please do drop them in. I'll stick around for a bit longer. If you do need to drop off now, please do click on the cross at the top right of your screen, and that will help you to leave the webinar. We had some really interesting questions prior to the webinar, just about measurement of certain types of impairment that we're having a look into, like, for example, whether certain tools that could be used to measure work with around autism, for example, and we were starting to have a look at that. So I think probably our best bet for best option for responding to some of your questions is to do that remotely after the call and share with the group. But if any of you do have questions now, I'll put myself on mute, but I'm happy to come in and respond to that and make sure they're directed at least to the right people. But in the meantime, thank you all for attending today. Thank you for those of you listening back, and for all the input that we've had. It's been really, really interesting. We'll get the recording of this webinar out next week, and along with the resources that we've discussed. And looking forward, hopefully, to seeing you on the next webinar in November. We're just deciding on the topic for the November and January webinars, and if you have any suggestions, we're going to be deciding on those in the next week or two. Feel free to feed in, and otherwise I hope you'll have very good remainders of your day, and we'll be in touch soon. And just to say, just as some comments come in, that Daniel, you've mentioned one comment on ASD, so you're more than happy to talk to people about that as you've got a lot of experience in creating these tools. I would love to have a chat about that, Daniel, actually, just myself, maybe outside of this webinar, because it's not a topic that I know certainly a lot about, and certainly not with evaluating that area of work, so would be really interested to hear more. And we'll be putting out a general email to you all to ask for your feedback, evaluating these different areas. So really appreciate that, and thank you for that offer, Daniel, as well. And Aysegul, you've mentioned too, perhaps looking at the topic of TPAC, technology, pedagogy, content, knowledge into inclusion. That'd be fascinating. So if you have any information you can send me on that, Aysegul, that'd be great, because that looks really interesting. So thank you for that suggestion. And Daniel Snays mentioned too, she'd love to hear more from you on that topic, as I would too. So do feel free to drop us a line on that as well. That would be great. And as I said, I'm just sticking around if there are any more comments or questions, but feel free to drop off in the meantime if you need to.